For the first 5 generations of Pokemon, the Dragon type was considered to be the best typing in the game, with the only real threat to dragons being other dragons. But that all changed in Generation 6 with the Fairy typing, a new type that was introduced to balance out the sheer power of the Dragon types. However, while the Fairy type may not necessarily be broken or overpowered, they're definitely the best type in the game, and they may be a bit too good as they hit real hard and they're extremely hard to take down. So, while they don't need a big change, I still think that the Fairy typing needs a nerf. Which is why in today's video, we're going to be taking a look at how to make the Fairy type weaker and make them a bit less deceptive, because these looks don't even give a glimpse of their incredible power. What's going on, guys? HybridHero here. Around half a year ago, I made a video talking about potential buffs the Ice type could get in Generation 8, and how to make them better overall since they're largely considered to be the weakest Pokemon type. And during that video, I asked you guys if you wanted to see me do the opposite, and talk about ways to nerf what is considered to be the strongest type in the game, the Fairy typing. And half a year later, I'm here to give you all what you requested. Real quick, I do want to say that, though I am going to be talking about ways to nerf the Fairy type, I am in no way a hardcore competitive Pokemon player. I don't know what the competitive battle scene is like. I'm just a fan of this series who plays Showdown and online battles occasionally, so some of my ideas may be a bit terrible or a bit too outlandish, so forgive me for that. But again, feel free to comment down below and let me know how you feel about my ideas. Now, while the Fairy typing isn't broken by any means, they are considered to be the best type by many fans and a very difficult type to go up against for many reasons. But I think the best way to explain the use of the Fairy types would be to talk about 5 different typings: Dragon, Fighting, Dark, Poison, and Steel. The type was kind of made to balance out these 5 types by getting players to use some of the more defensive types more often, by getting them to use them more offensively, and just nerfing the offensive capabilities of 3 of the biggest offensive threats so that players can use Pokemon of those types less often. To be honest, I don't know why Fire was affected, but it probably has something to do with actual fairy tales. On paper, this actually looks like a really solid plan to balance out some of the most specialized, used, and underused typings in the game. However, the biggest problem with this is that the Fairy type is only weak to 2 of the weakest offensive types. Like I said, with this, the plan was basically to get people to use more Poison and Steel type Pokemon, or at the very least, Poison and Steel type moves while using less Dragon, Fighting, and Dark type Pokemon. And people have been using more Poison and Steel type Pokemon and or moves, but it just hasn't been enough. But more so than that, people have just been using more Fairy type Pokemon instead of Poison or Steel types. 2 or more Fairy type Pokemon would generally fit a team better than 2 Poison types, 2 Steel types, or a combination of the 2. And even if you did have a Pokemon of neutral type effectiveness, the Fairy type still hits hard with moves like Moonblast and Play Rough. And most of them are pretty tanky, so it's gonna be hard to take him out with non-stab Poison and Steel type moves. On top of this, a good number of them have ways to counter the Poison and Steel type Pokemon with their dual typings and move pool. And honestly, I think this is the biggest problem. The Fairy typing just makes for an incredibly scary dual typing. The moment you slap Fairy on with almost any other type in this game, that Pokemon just sounds like a threat. A threat that's hard to take down, so I'd say if we're gonna change anything to the Fairy type, it's to just give them more weaknesses. Cause, like I said, the reason they exist is to balance out the other typings. They need to be there to make the already super offensive typings a bit weak, and the super defensive typings a bit more strong. So, we can't really change anything regarding these 5 types. But since the Fairy type only has 2 uncommon weaknesses, we can make it so that the Fairy type gains 2 more really uncommon weaknesses. This way, the Fairy typing is still doing its job as acting as the balance between the types and helping out the weaker types while nerfing the strong ones. And I think having 4 uncommon weaknesses still leaves them better off than having 2 or 3 weaknesses to common offensive types. So, what 2 weaknesses shall we give them? Well, you may have noticed earlier that I skipped over a certain type that's actually affected by the Fairy typing: the Bug type. Bug type moves are actually resisted by Fairy types, and again, I think some mythological or fairy tale logic may be what's causing this. I'm not too sure. But in terms of the game itself, I don't think this is a great idea, because the Bug type sucks offensively. It resists 3 types, it's weak to 3 types, it's strong against 3 types, but it can barely touch 7 different types. Without the fairy typing, it'd be at 6, but that's still a lot of types that resist bug, and a good variety of types at that. It's part of the reason as to why bug-type Pokemon aren't used too often. You'll always have Pokemon using moves like U-Turn and Leech Life, but those moves are more so for the secondary effects rather than to dish out damage. I know it'd be a drastic change if the fairy type suddenly went from resisting the type to being weak against it, but honestly, I think it's a very valuable change to make. The bug typing would still not be too great offensively, and the fairy typing still doesn't have any extreme weaknesses by any means. It just balances out these two typings a bit more by making a really weak type good against a strong type. And I think I can say the same to the grass type if we made fairy weak to it as well. Believe it or not, even though it's a starter type, the grass type might actually be almost as bad as the bug type, if not worse. 5 weaknesses and 4 resistances isn't that big of a difference, but it still has the same issue of offensive capabilities, as 7 types resist the grass type, and only 3 types are weak against it. Yeah, considering that the water type only has 2 weaknesses, it's great that the grass type is super effective against it. But why on earth are the last 2 types that grass is super effective against ground and rock? The grass and water types basically share the exact same super effective capabilities, it's just that one is super effective against water and the other is super effective against fire. The big difference here is that water is meant to be more of a defensive type, hence 2 weaknesses and more of a balanced board. Grass on the other hand, yeah, there are definitely more cons than pros. And considering how common water and electric type Pokemon are, it just makes a lot more sense to use 2 Pokemon of these types, or a Pokemon that can learn a water and electric type move than most of the grass types in the game. So, by making the grass type super effective against fairy type Pokemon, yeah, it doesn't make much sense if you think about it, but it will definitely make this underused type a lot more viable and scare off the fairies a bit more. Really, these are the only 2 changes that I think need to be made. Again, with these changes, the fairy type still does its job of balancing out the existing types, and it still nerfs the stronger types while buffing the weaker types. And since these types are weak, people still aren't going to use them all too often. They do have more of a reason to use them now, but our main goal was to reduce the usage of fairy type Pokemon. And honestly, the bug and grass types don't even have to resist the fairy type. The fairy type needs more weaknesses, and the bug and grass types need more types to be strong against, so just change those 2 things, and I think you balance things out pretty well among these 3 types. If you do feel as though I've nerfed the fairy type a bit too much, then we can get rid of the fire type's resistance to fairy. I still don't know why it's there, and in terms of the game mechanics, it doesn't need to be there. The fire type is already pretty lit defensively, so it won't be that big of a deal. I know that, regardless of what, one Pokemon type will probably always be better than the others, and one type will probably always be seen as worse than the others. But I definitely do think a few changes can be made to balance things out a bit more. But even with these changes, I wouldn't be surprised if the type of the Dragon Destroyers remains supreme, cause, man, they sure are an incredibly strong type to go up against. Thanks for watching, guys. I hope you enjoyed. What do you guys think? Am I getting too crazy with my ideas, or does the fairy typing actually need a nerf? Comment down below and let me know. Also, if you enjoyed the video and if you haven't already, be sure to check out my video on how to buff the ice type. Be sure to hit a bunch of like button if you enjoyed the video, and hit the dislike button if you didn't. Let me know how you feel. Share the video around if it helps with the channel. And finally, subscribe if you want to stay up to date with all my content. Take care of yourselves, have a wonderful day, and I will see you on the next video, alright? Later.